Welcome to the Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Kingstonian Podcast as we kick off Season 8. After a short summer break, we're diving into a topic that hits close to home for many of us: access to local news. In recent years, we've seen large corporations take over smaller media outlets, and unfortunately, this has led to the closure of numerous local papers, radio, and TV stations. Staying informed on what's happening in our own communities is becoming a challenge. To shed some light on this issue, I'm joined today by Christopher Fenning, an English professor at Queen's University. Together with his wife, Karen Valihora, they took action by purchasing the Picton Gazette, the oldest weekly newspaper in Canada, dedicated to keeping local stories alive. This episode was recorded in early October 2024. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
This is where I thought I would start with this. Earlier this summer, our local TV station and its two associated radio stations were shut down permanently by their corporate owners. And in reaction to that shutdown, you were quoted as saying that local journalism was at a crossroads. Can you tell me what you meant by that?
Well, as your example suggests, we have a concentration of media at head offices in remote locations or locations remote from our communities. And the crossroads is who will report on what's actually happening in our community, as opposed to somebody deciding what to run in a community paper from hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles away. And the crossroads is really, do we have what we need supplied by our media? And I suggest that if it's run from a head office in Toronto or Ottawa or somewhere else, we don't have what we need. And so the crossroads is really a decision for supporting local reporting on things that are happening in our communities.
As a consumer of information personally, and I've had this discussion with other folks, is that when something happens in the community, how do you find out what's going on? And one of the things that people tend to do is go to social media.
Yes.
And what's your view on social media as it relates to local news coverage?
Social media is not regulated in any fashion. And social media can spread news quickly. It can also distort news very quickly. And one of the important things about a local media source, whether it's the radio or the television or the newspaper, is that you have someone trusted and reliable who can sift through the event and be trusted to give what happened, as opposed to a lot of opinions and misattributions. You know, social media is fraught with conspiracy theories, and it's funny. I see this in my community. Even the most minor incidents can be turned around to some sort of manipulation by outside forces, whether it's foreign governments, our own federal government, and sometimes even aliens. And we're talking about a car accident at a particular intersection. So, you know, that's obviously an extreme case, but social media just lets this happen. And sometimes people will joke about it, and that's great. You have to have your perspective in place when you're on social media. It's not an absolute and authoritative source, and therefore we need to keep in mind that we always need to double check what it is we're getting there. Social media definitely spreads news, and I think that that's valuable, but we do need to have a sort of backup that's going to verify what's happening.
We do know that this podcast is being listened to in different parts of the province, the country, the world. We've had some feedback. And we here are sort of focused on this particular issue because of the closure of this outlet that's been in place since 1942.
Mm-hmm.
And one statistic I read when I was looking up some information on this issue, and that's the fact that since 2008, nearly 300 news outlets have gone, 231 of them being newspapers in 180 different communities across this country.
Yes.
And that's a scary concept.
Yes, it is. Some of them, you might have checked into this, some of them probably were bought out by a large corporation like Postmedia, and they survived for a while. But Postmedia's method is to sort of buy it up, drain it, and close it. And so one of the things that we're dealing with here is the question of supporting a local media. And what we really need to keep in mind is how important it is that we know, it's like being neighbors. It's that we know what's going on in our community from within our community, as opposed to someone deciding one item to report. Some of these community newspapers run by Postmedia will employ the same reporter on every paper and send him or her out to cover something for one paper at the same time as for another paper, or send them around, and they're spread very thin. And they can't know every community.
Can you effectively provide local coverage without a locally based paper or radio station or television station?
Well, it depends. I suppose it depends on what you mean by locally based. It's the CBC has radio stations in a variety of cities. Kingston has one, and they do have local reporters. The proportion of reporting, I think, is something that's very important. A local paper should have predominantly local stories in it, as opposed to one story and then some things from The Wire and some ads from big box stores.
Now, as we said in the introduction to the program, you speak with some authority on this particular subject because back in 2023, you and your wife, Karen Valihora, purchased the Picton Gazette, which is the oldest weekly newspaper in Canada, a paper that goes back to 1830. And for those not familiar with the geography who may never have been to Kingston or to Picton, tell us a little bit about where Picton is and about the town itself.
Picton is the major town in Prince Edward County, which is now an island jutting out into Lake Ontario. In 1830, it was a peninsula. They cut a canal through in the 1890s, thus making it an island. And believe me, there are plenty of backing and forthing within the community about whether we should call it an island or not. But it's more or less halfway between Toronto and Kingston on the north side of Lake Ontario, and you can get there by car. You cannot get there by train anymore. That's been decommissioned. And back in the 19th century, you used to arrive by steamboat.
Now, I've been to Picton several times. Tell us a little bit about the town and what it has to offer, what it's known for.
Picton has a long history. It wasn't called Picton in 1830. It was called Hallowell. And our paper was called the Hallowell Free Press until 1837 when Picton changed its name officially. Picton was a town that had a port, and it was focused on its agrarian economy. So there were different crops at different times. Barley was a big one in the later 19th century. Tomato canning piers were built and shipped directly. There's a fishing industry around. And much of the county's heritage is wrapped around that agricultural economy. It has been changing in the recent several decades. It's now known as a wine-growing region. And this is a twist on the agricultural heritage. It is much more engaged now with what we would call agro-tourism, where people are coming to the county to sample the wine and to experience farm-to-table events in a way that has tipped the balance towards what we call a tourist economy. It also has a higher proportion of retirees living in it. And so that shift has taken place over the last several decades. But I must say that if you look through the archive of the Picton Gazette, they've been very excited about tourism for well over 100 years, all the way through.
What drew you and your wife to Picton in the first place? Because you live there now.
We do. We live in Cressy, which is about 20 minutes outside Picton. We had an old farmhouse which we used as a sort of a weekend cottage. And then when the pandemic hit and we lived in Toronto was all taped up and we had small kids who couldn't even go to the park, we thought, let's just decamp and go to the cottage and we'll weather the 6 weeks and come back. Well, as everybody knows, it was a lot more than 6 weeks. And before we knew it, we had enrolled the kids in the local school. And when the school was open, that school bus would take the kids into town, and we kind of settled in. And before we knew it, we never had a deliberate conversation, but before we knew it, we were staying. Mm-hmm. And so we sold the Toronto house, and we actually moved within the county just around the corner from where we were to a brick house rather than a wooden farmhouse. And as a part of that move, we had always valued the Picton Gazette as a connection to the community. We were newcomers. We wanted to know what was going on. We looked forward to it every week. And we did notice that it was getting a little bit thinner. COVID was really hard on everybody, all businesses. They had closed the Main Street office of the Picton Gazette. They had removed the newspaper boxes, and it was looking a little bit shaky. And we, both being English professors, really valued the act of communication, the written word, and we saw that many community members, really all community members, really loved the paper. It was very important, and everybody read it cover to cover. And this made us feel connected, especially in a pandemic time when we weren't really allowed to connect in, physically, like, maintain your distance and all that kind of stuff. And so we had heard a rumor that the owners, the Morrison family, might be interested in selling the paper. And we pursued it. It took quite a long time to negotiate, well over a year. But eventually, in May of 2023, we had become the publishers.
Now, I guess we should say that Cressy is, 40 minutes from Kingston?
Well, as the crow flies, it's 40 minutes from Kingston. If I could ride a boat from the eastern tip of the island, Prince Edward County, which is Cressy, I could probably get to Kingston in 40 minutes. Unfortunately, I have to drive about 20 minutes the wrong direction to get on the ferry and then drive back. But it's a lovely drive. And I'm very grateful not to be on the 401. And everybody I know is always leaving wherever they are, timing it to the ferry.
Right. And the 401, for those from afar, is as a main artery across the province. It's a big highway.
Yes.
So you teach here at Queen's University in Kingston.
Yes.
And your wife teaches at York University in Toronto. You're
Correct.
Both English literature professors. So you go one way, and Karen goes the other way.
Yes.
And you get together in the middle to run the newspaper and raise a family.
This is true. We are sometimes just waving at each other on the road as we trade off.
Now, you've already partially answered the question that I had next, which was, given all the negative stuff we've talked about so far about the status of local news coverage, you decided to buy the paper anyway.
Yes.
And the paper has, as we've already said, been around since 1830. History of the paper, it's a weekly paper. Has it always been a weekly paper?
It has almost always been a weekly paper. In 1830 it was. There were some moments at various points in the later 20th century when they experimented with coming out twice a week. Once it had one day a week it had a Picton focus, and then the next day it would have a broader county focus. It has been through different models of subscription, paying for the newspaper, but it is currently a free weekly paper supported by advertising.
The paper, from what I have read, has been fairly successful since you guys took it over.
So far, so good.
So far.
We are keeping our day jobs.
Now, has that got something to do with the fact that it's a newspaper in a small town?
Oh, I think so, for sure. As I said in my story about coming to the county and coming to the paper, the community really values the newspaper as an institution. And one of the nice things about it is that there are some companies that advertise in our newspaper who really don't have to advertise. They might be the only game in town, or they've been around for so long everybody knows about them, but they make a point of putting an ad in our paper every week or every other week because they feel it shows a community. They're members of the community. And I really think that community focus is essential. And I would say personally, having become the publisher of this local newspaper, it has been very rewarding to me and to Karen as a way of integrating with the community. I can step out the door of the office on Main Street and people will greet me. I don't always know who they are, but they know who I am, and we can stop and talk. People will come in and talk about a story. They'll drop off a letter to the editor. Some people, old school, are coming in to pay for their classified ad in cash. There's a hub, and the community itself has many hubs. The Regent Theater is a very popular spot to go, and it's kind of a reference point. There are many such places, and we feel that we're sort of a satellite within the hub of the community based in Picton, but really stretching across the whole county.
So the local paper is basically perpetuating a conversation amongst the people that live in the county. One of the roles it plays.
It's neighborly, and people want to know what's going on. They also want to know how things that are happening here in our community are related to larger trends and so on, so that there's nothing that happens in any small community that isn't indicative of a much wider culture, whether it's national or international. We're living in a global world. And part of the mission of a newspaper, I think, is not just to say what's happening in this community, but to connect it to these wider trends and give some insight for people who feel they themselves are in a unique situation, and let them know that this is part of a bigger picture. And that, I think, is enabling. It gives a lot of perspective to readers who, without that, might feel completely isolated within just the community and feel frustrated that there's very little that their council representatives can do. Well, it's the newspaper's job to say, council only goes so far. Some of these things that are happening are provincial policies or federal policies or just global trends. You know, small businesses are the predominant business model within our community, and they're constantly struggling against Amazon, against these large conglomerates. And it's really important that a newspaper, when it talks about issues like that, connects the dots so that people can understand how important it is, say, to shop local, rather than the convenience and perhaps economy of using something like Amazon.
From what you're saying, it's really difficult to be able to tack on a percentage to say, inside each issue of our newspaper, we are going to have so much out-of-town stuff and so much local stuff, because your perspective is to want to connect or be able to connect what's happening locally to what may be happening outside the community?
I would say that for the most part, we're not going to impose some grand observations that don't have a local touch point. So in many ways, I think that everything we do in the paper starts with the local. And what we try to do is put it in a perspective so that we're not going to be engaging in foreign wars, for example. There have been times when there have been local protests about foreign wars in town, and that's the time where you can introduce something like that. And the editorial pages are the places especially where you can branch out and you can talk about things that have been going on for a while and say, have you guys noticed these things happening in town? Well, let's put this in a different kind of context. Yeah. And I should say that the feedback we get, whether it's directly in person talking to people or from letters and so on, is that there's a lot of gratitude for trying to do this work and trying to keep that perspective available. Because one of the things that a local paper really should do is not be isolationist, but it should connect us to the rest of the world.
When the TV station and the 2 radio stations were shut down, there were a lot of people who were talking about the concept of somebody should buy that building where it is now and reopen the station with a local focus. And from my perspective, as someone who used to work in that industry and that very building many moons ago, it's a case of, okay, it's nice to have local coverage provided by local ownership, but it has to be supported by local advertisers if it's going to stay in business. And the same applies to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's something that is supported externally, perhaps through government grants, and the Picton Gazette has received a few federal grants. We've recently won what they call a Local Journalism Initiative reporter, which is a federal program that helps local papers hire reporters, and we're very grateful for that. But if the local advertisers are actually the sign of the health of your newspaper, or your radio station or TV station, because it means that local advertisers see it as valuable and see that it has an investment from the community. And that's obviously what an advertiser wants to know.
Now, your newspaper, which publishes every Wednesday, is keeping up with the times, and you have a digital edition of the newspaper, but you also print a copy of the newspaper as well. I guess it takes a while for someone, and I assume you've hired somebody to handle the digital side to present the news in a format that those who want to look at the news on their computers or their phones. My question is, and I've talked to a lot of old folks like me who it's not a newspaper unless they can hold it in their hands. And I don't know how predominant that is, or is that just a generational thing?
It's probably generational, but I actually have some strong opinions about holding things in your hands to read them. To start with, the website. We're very proud of the website. We did a complete redesign to match the redesign of the physical paper so that there's a harmony between them. We have found, somewhat to our surprise, what you've just said, is that people actually really value and in many ways prefer the print edition. So the website is there for those who are not present to receive the paper. The website is there for short-term updates. We're a weekly after all. And so if there's a breaking story, we'll push it to the website. And it's also there as something of a record. It's searchable. People can find what we said last year or the year before. I think we've backed up the website to as far back as 2017 or 2018. I find it valuable as an archive in those terms. But to your point about the physical copy, it's definitely a local expectation that the physical copy is definitive. This is what people want. We have arranged with Canada Post to deliver a copy of this newspaper to every single post box in the county. It's 14,300 post boxes. But you know what happens? The paper is delivered the night before on Tuesday nights, and we put it out in various places, a few shops and newspaper boxes and so on, and people are rushing out to open those boxes and get it hot off the presses, even though they know that the next day, in most cases it's on the Wednesday, could be the Thursday, they will receive their own copy. So there's a bit of a paradox that we have to order these extra copies so that everyone can, in essence, have two. We don't quite multiply it that much. But and here's a good story. The post office, we had placed a newspaper box out front of the post office. And they gave us permission to do this, but they very kindly, after a while, asked us if we could move it across the street. Why? Because they found that people were picking up their Gazette from the newspaper box and not going into the post office to check their box in the post office, and the boxes were getting filled up. So we were kind of flattered that the only reason people are checking their mail is to get the Gazette. And we are making arrangements to move the box across the street in the hopes that the post office can keep its business efficient.
Now, those of us who have been in radio at some point in our lives are looking at the future, and with all the advances in technology that have come to pass over the past 50 years, at least I see a point when radio will be digital all the time, and there will be no towers broadcasting. Do you see newspapers going digital? Do you still see people wanting to get that physical copy even 10, 15 years down the road?
That's the threat. And I sincerely hope it does not come to that. As an English professor who teaches books all the time, I am these days, more every year, pleading with my students to get the physical copy of the book. I honestly believe that you can't read a book without a pencil in your hand and a physical copy to annotate and fold down pages and circle things and so on as you go. Now, I realize that's a little bit academic and you can't do that at the beach. But however, there have been many studies, cognitive studies done, that a text read in a physical copy that you hold stays longer with the reader and is better remembered than the same text on a screen. This is just a cognitive fact. There's something distracting about the pixels that is not there. And there's something reinforcing about the haptic experience of holding that thing in your hand. I teach some very, very long books. Samuel Richardson's Clarissa is one of my favorite novels. It's 1,000,000 words long. It's still the longest novel in the English language. And I have memories. I'm trying to think about where a particular sentence or passage was, and my body helps me. I think about, was it heavier on the right-hand side or the left-hand side? And that'll help me figure out what section was. Was it the top or bottom corner, left or right? And I honestly believe that print in the physical version is something that is to be celebrated. I think the virtual world that is promised by so many of the Silicon Valley designers is a lessening of human experience. And I firmly believe that paper copies of even just your weekly community newspaper make a difference and remind us that we're human beings, that we live amongst real people, and we can shake their hands when we greet them or wave and have a casual conversation in a way that the remoteness of the digital world can never replace.
There's some simplistic advantage to a print copy as well, in my mind, is that if you are reading a print copy, you're not having to scroll from one screen to the next to get the whole story, because rarely can you see the whole story on one screen.
Yes.
And so going back and forth can be annoying. Whereas if you have the whole print thing in front of you, then you don't have to do that.
There are studies and anecdotal evidence that on the screen people will only read the headline, or they won't actually do that scroll to finish the story. And it's certainly the case in some of the Facebook debates that I have witnessed that people are not clicking through to read a story. They're just going on whatever the headline that got posted on Facebook is. And man, that can just go down a road that has no connection to the story that people are ostensibly talking about. Mm-hmm. So there's something about the physical copy and just being able to, point to it. And also to know that someone else, somewhere, is holding the same thing in their hands. And there's a connection there. There's a public sphere that exists because we know, it may be theoretical, but we know that we can bump into people. We can meet people. And the physical copy is a reminder of that. Mm-hmm. The anonymity of the internet is, I think, as I said before, a lessening of the human experience.
Well, Chris, you and Karen have embarked on a very interesting journey, and I wish you every success, and I want to thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's been great to talk with you.
Our guest was Chris Fanning, co-owner and publisher of the oldest weekly newspaper in Canada. You can email the paper at info@pictongazette.ca. Please take a moment to leave us a comment about this episode. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back soon with another conversation.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to the Kingstonian Podcast at gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.